Welcome to the AI+HI Project. I'm Alex Alonso, SHRM's Chief Data and Analytics Officer. Thanks for joining us today. This week, we're discussing President Trump's recent executive orders regarding AI and what these changes mean for businesses and HR leaders. Our guests this week are Rachel C., Senior Counsel at Seyfarth Shaw and SHRM's policy partner, and Ben Eubanks, Chief Research Officer at Lighthouse Research and Advisory. Welcome to the AI+HI Project, Rachel and Ben.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, Alex.
Good to see you both. I want to give you a moment to kind of introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about what you do in your current roles. Rachel, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Rachel C. I'm Senior Counsel at Seyfarth, and my practice here focuses on AI risk management, focusing on the labor and employment space. Before coming back to Seyfarth in 2023, I was at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in a bunch of roles from enforcement to management, and also working on AI policy for Commissioner Keith Sonderling. So I am a former AI regulator, now helping employers navigate through regulations and all of the technical and social and legal issues with using AI for HR.
Ben, how about you? Tell us about you.
Absolutely. So I'm the Chief Research Officer for Lighthouse Research and Advisory. And before that, I was actually an HR practitioner in the trenches. So I love bringing the practical side and the data side and trying to tell some stories about how we help all of our friends in HR do their work better. I've written several books. The one that's probably most relevant to this conversation is called Artificial Intelligence for HR. It was really the first book in the world written on that topic, bringing those two things together and trying to make it easier for employers to understand the far-reaching promise and the far-reaching potential concerns around AI and how that fits into that bigger picture.
And I can say that having worked with both these individuals independently, both their work is incredibly meaningful and really is pushing the conversation around AI. And especially as it relates to the world of employers. Now I want to go ahead and pivot, and let's get to the meat of what we're talking about here today. Before we dive into President Trump's AI executive order, I want to take a moment to rewind and think back to October of 2023, when former President Biden introduced the first executive order ever focused on artificial intelligence. That EO specifically required tech industry to develop safety and security measures and standards, but then also introduced consumer and worker protections and gave federal agencies a to-do list to oversee the progress of the kinds of technologies that are related to AI. My question for you when thinking about this, can you share why it was such a critical moment or directive at the time, and why was it needed? And I'll start first with you, Ben. What do you think?
So at that time, if you can rewind back that far in your head, some of us have a hard time doing that, but we were less than a year from the implementation of ChatGPT into the availability of that in the market. And love it or hate it, that AI conversation suddenly got a tremendous shove forward. I've been speaking and sharing on this topic to HR audiences since 2018. And for many of those early years, it was sort of theoretical, out there, futuristic. And suddenly that made it a today thing. For many of them, they could go and try these things out. And not just HR, but any profession, any person, any individual could start doing that same thing. And I believe that's what really drove this, is the government started seeing, like many employers were seeing, the opportunity for this tool to be used for good or for ill. And they started thinking about what sort of protections are we going to need on the workers for the work that they're doing? Are we going to need around preventing bias in the workplace and other decisions that can be made with this? And so they started thinking about that bigger picture and really leaning in on how can we make sure we're doing the right things, advancing technology, but also protecting the people who are using it.
I appreciate that perspective. Rachel, I know that this was a particularly personal kind of experience for you with this executive order, having been part of various administrations and focusing on AI. I remember the day we were actually together, the day that it was launched, or it was signed, I should say. And I remember hearing about your interpretation of all the various pieces, because I also remember it being one of the longest executive orders I've ever read in my entire life. Rachel, why was it so critical at that point in time?
Well, I think the first thing that it accomplished was it got people talking, and it got people thinking about both the benefits and the risks associated with AI. Alex, can I actually your first question here, because President Trump, in his first administration, did have an executive order on AI, and there were some foundational things that executive order started the federal government doing, started getting agencies, requiring agencies to think about how they were using AI, how they wanted to use AI, and there were several themes that are picked up in what we see here in the second Trump administration, and what President Biden's executive order did, again, building off of that. We have the government building off of prior work until it doesn't. But when, President Biden issued his executive order, I think a lot of us were calling it, well, it's a whole of government order. And that's why it was so long, because it has all of these little tidbits to all of the departments, as many departments as you can think of, even some that you wouldn't expect would have a lot to do with AI. And, I think there was this real charge, or this perception that it was a real charge to all of these enforcement agencies to say, well, think about how we can use our existing authority or proposals for using our existing authority to regulate AI, to address some of these perceived harms that the president was ordering. And on the other hand, and while doing all of that risk-based work, all of that regulatory work, also saying to the federal government, and we want to embrace AI, and we want to, help America be better at AI and make all of these investments in AI. So slow down, watch out, here's some regulation, but speed up also, and let's take advantage of all of the positive of AI. It's trying to do both. And that's a complicated thing to do.
I appreciate that. And that's a healthy revision, because I do recall, you're absolutely right. President Trump did, in fact, have the first executive order, even with the exploration of AI and exploring what it is that is absolutely critical. And more importantly, I do see the guardrails that you've kind of put around this conversation in a critical way. I think it's important to remember that it's both exploration and at the same time ensuring that we're being mindful of how we use it. So one thing I want to jump to next is present day in particular. And I want to think a little bit about what it was like as we look at what it is today and what the executive orders are doing, and think about, we know in his first day in office, President Trump rescinded the initial Biden executive order on AI. And then he issued his own that was really focused primarily on thinking about what are some of the key tenets, the objectives, and more importantly, the key components around what it is that AI will be used for and or explored for, and how we build an infrastructure around that. I'm going to switch things up here a little bit and ask specifically, how do you interpret the recent AI orders that were put forth by President Trump, and what do you take away from them? Rachel, I'm going to start with you.
So the day one executive order fulfills President Trump's campaign promise to revoke President Biden's order. So that order is gone. All of the underlying agency actions and some of the things that the federal government is doing with its own use of AI, that's being reconsidered. There are deadlines in that first executive order. And we have an end of March deadline that's coming up for the federal government, for OMB, to take a look at some of these Biden policies and see what explicitly needs to be revoked, maintained, or revised. So there's the fundamental policy declarations that President Biden made. Those are gone, and we have that replaced with President Trump's vision. Not just in the executive order, but what else we've heard from the administration, and we'll see how that translates into policy. And we've had OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, requesting input from thousands of stakeholders have submitted their input on where we're suggesting the administration should be focusing its AI strategy, its AI priorities. There's been things that agencies have quickly revoked that were done under President Biden's EO, and there's other things that quietly remain because they're foundational. They're foundational to how the government itself is trying to use AI or purchase AI, and we'll see that tweaked. we'll absolutely see that tweaked, but I don't think we'll see all of it go away because it can't. It's part of how government works and has to work, I think.
Ben, same question to you.
It's no surprise to anyone that works in the world of HR, that a Democratic administration is going to put things in place that are pro-worker, right? Trying to think about the workforce, protecting them, preventing bias, all those sorts of things. And so the shift out for the new executive order, Rachel covers some really great things in that. The only things I'll say, Rachel mentioned that that first executive order, if you go actually look at some of the wording in that, it has words in there that might surprise you to hear it in as brash as it feels like this shift has been with the new administration. Words like responsible, transparent, accountable, respectful, those are words that were in the very first Trump executive order around AI. And those things, I believe, are still part of what this administration wants that to be. But they've really shifted that a little bit away from that pro-worker piece and the protective piece to more of a, how can we be innovative? How can we faster? How can we move quicker than other countries can? Because this needs to be something we're focusing on as a country, as a set of industries. And so that's where they're really leaning their side. And it's no surprise to anyone, again, because of Trump's pro-business background. That's his focus. It's where he came from. It's where he spent a lot of his career. And so he's now trying to empower those companies. The challenge that I see with that is that we often are overly optimistic in what we expect companies to do for the best interest of everyone. And what you find is sometimes they do that, and sometimes they do things that are in their own best interests. And we're seeing some of those destructive behaviors already from the companies that are out there right now in the market developing AI. Some of those destructive things are already happening.
So it's fascinating you raise that, because I do want to kind of do a little bit of a follow-up there and talk a little bit about how you see that actually shaping or changing HR strategy, right? You hit upon the notion that obviously liberals versus conservatives, some are, liberals tend to be pro-worker, conservatives tend to be pro-employer. But at the end of the day, we see shifts in HR strategy that kind of materialize from some of what we're talking about. How do you anticipate that the big vision for what we're seeing around AI and AI development actually changes HR strategies, whether it be hiring for AI related roles, whether it be creating new AI roles that we've never even thought about? What do you see coming from that, Ben?
So I'm actually curious to hear what Rachel says around some of that, because I know there's been a conversation around what policies you need, things like that, to back that up and protect that from the employer perspective. I will say that the HR professionals and leaders that I talk to are excited about the possibilities. They're looking at ways to use these tools. They're trying to be smarter at that. But at the same time, the thing that concerns me the most, frankly, is the story that isn't being told nearly as much about some of the new data coming out around these tools affecting people's ability to be creative, their ability to be innovative. Data from Microsoft, University of Toronto, and other organizations starting to show those things. And so we have this picture in our head of AI being this positive outcome, this journey towards something better, where we're spending less time doing that mundane stuff that none of us want to do anyway, and more time doing the things that bring us to life and bring us joy. But the concern that I have is the research is showing that offloading those things is hurting us in ways we don't yet fully understand. And we're not even sure what that means long-term yet. It's just hard to wrap our heads around that. From an HR perspective specifically, the types of jobs and roles that I'm seeing start to emerge there, things like people really leaning in on how do we create better experiences? Let's focus on the experience design and not just on processing paperwork. How can we think about where tools can be used safely, where we can automate some of the work our people are doing, and how do we make sure that we're protecting the jobs of the people who are doing some of these other things, right? There are companies right now, as we speak, that are replacing different types of roles. And there's a lot of data coming out around entry-level jobs that are steadily being consumed by some of the new generative AI tools. And so any HR leader that hasn't started thinking about those sorts of things yet needs to start having those conversations at an executive level, because those decisions are being made in many organizations right now. And if you're not in the room, who's going to advocate for the people?
I think it's a mistake to think or to believe that the Trump administration's AI policies are not pro-worker. That Vice President Vance and President Trump have very explicitly said they want to be pro-worker. And on AI, Vice President Vance has very much said the Trump administration will maintain a pro-worker growth path for AI. And their vision on AI policy and regulation is that they're doing things that their AI policy is pro-worker, because their vision is that this is about job creation, about empowering American industry, about making America, leaders in AI, and to use the vice president's own words, to make us more productive, more prosperous, and more free. So as with all things political, I think there can be agreement that yes, this is the goal, and there may be debates, there may be differing visions about how we get to that goal. And I think that if you look at some of the labor policies and some of the goals behind deregulation, or the goals behind these differing regulatory visions, I think the Trump administration is trying to be pro-worker in its AI policies.
I really appreciate that perspective, Rachel, and Ben, yours too. I think about our own thought leadership here at SHRM, and I see the two sides of the coin, right? We see in particular that there are advantages that we're experiencing as a result of AI, and some of which deal specifically with better experiences for workers, new job growth. Ben, you referenced the notion of experiences as a whole, and I'm seeing that as the number one AI-based job that's growing is people who are creating experiences, either for customers, employees, take your pick, in the vein of HR. And Rachel, I think specifically to some of the things that you were alluding to around being pro-worker and how that really does put an onus on AI used to foster personal growth, learning and development opportunities, foster different productivity, different impact in people's lives, and changing career growth. I guess my question to you both as a follow-up is, how might some of these kind of varying kind of advantages shift or change as we see the executive order kind of materialize and become more operational in the way that we look at it, both within the government but beyond, as you look at it? And I'll start with you, Rachel, since I started with Ben last time.
Fair. Alex, I think this is less about what the executive order says, because the executive order is laying out a vision for policy, and more about what the government is going to do and what their regulatory perspective is going to be. So, I think the broad Trump administration perspective here is that AI is a critical issue of global competitiveness. And so if we're trying to, make America first in AI, that's looking at global competition with China and seeing it as a national security issue against China and whoever global adversaries may be. And also specifically looking at, the European model of regulation and seeing, the sharp criticisms that the vice president made, of the European model of AI regulation, and what that means for hampering R&D, hampering adoption, slowing down adoption. So, when you look at the vice president's remarks in Paris in February, I think that's really laying out the vision of the administration for how they're going to get to the results they want of empowering American industry, and that's hands-off regulation. That we want to embrace technology, and we're rejecting the European model of regulation here. Now, what does that mean for HR professionals? Does that mean that you can just do whatever? Well, I don't think so. I think that understanding that if you're moving to a self-regulatory environment, you still want AI that is safe, reliable, and trustworthy. You're just not going to have the government giving you these very long documents that may or may not spell out what you have to do to comply, that might not get you fully to safe, trustworthy, and reliable AI. You still have, all of these obligations, and if you want it to work, you're going to have to wrestle with these issues also. So it doesn't end the AI safety conversation. It just shifts the safety conversation away from, here's what the government is requiring me to do, to, it's now on industry. It's now more clearly on me. And the government's not going to save us from this. The government's not going to tell us exactly what to do via regulation.
So, it's funny. Here I was hoping that there was a world one day where HR would get to willy-nilly do whatever they wanted. Clearly, that's not going to happen anytime soon, though. Ben, how about you? What do you see as sort of the advantages, the things that are popping up that are really kind of unlocked as part of the potential behind some of these recent policy shifts?
So really it's interesting that we're talking about these things, but a lot of the growth in the AI industry has happened in the last few years prior to even the Trump administration and some of the new executive order and the focus of that. So even with, we talked about a minute ago, some of those policies and things, the industry is growing rapidly, and the capabilities of the AI technologies are honestly mind-blowing in some cases compared to what they were even a few years ago. And so that innovation, the expectation is going to continue. Rachel used the word deregulation a minute ago. And if you go back and you look at the history of deregulation in the US, you see a couple of things happening. When the government says, we're going to step back a little bit, we're going to remove some of the oversight here, the protections here, we're going to remove some of the overhead or red tape. You see innovation spike. Usually you see things like better competition in the space. You see those sorts of outcomes there. You see industry growth. Those are all things we're hoping for. And that's what you sort of see in the aspirations of how the administration is talking about this. At the same time, I would be remiss if I didn't say we also see things we don't expect. They're called unintended consequences because we didn't intend them. So you see things like when energy was deregulated, it created the opportunity for a company with unethical leadership like Enron to step in and take advantage of how things were done in the new model with that deregulation and make millions of dollars in profits, basically gouging people. So those sorts of things are potential outcomes. And I sound like a negative rain cloud, doom cloud kind of person. I do have a lot of optimism here. I do believe that AI has the opportunity to change work for the better, to change lives for the better, to help HR leaders reclaim a little bit of that sanity, because they're facing burnout and stress at higher levels. And that's across every single worker. I hope for that. And I'm also trying to be realistic about the motives and the motivations of people who are out there that are developing these tools. As I mentioned earlier, they're doing some destructive things. I'll give you an example of that. If you are a person who creates graphic art, for example, and you have a unique style that sets you apart, that helps you to earn a living to feed your family, these AI tools are trained on copyrighted material all the time. And your art can be used to train a model, and someone can create a cheap AI knockoff of the things that you used to create with your hands, and you get no royalty, you get no benefit from that. And those companies are making so much money off of selling that software that if you try to take them to court to fight back, you don't have enough money to fight them off because they're making so much on the other end. And so like those sorts of things are real right now and are happening. And that's an example of how these companies, the profit motive drives them to do things even that may be harmful or damaging to the individuals who are doing the work. And I want to make sure those things are not lost in this. Again, I don't want to stray too far from the HR conversation, but just to give an example of what's happening out there right now and what's possible to be used negatively when it comes to AI, not just bias and employment and all the other things we think about.
Yeah. And, you raise a great point. I think about it. We have all three of us have a mutual colleague, I suspect, from Fordham Law School, Professor Shlomit Yanisky Ravid, right? And she talks about in most cases, you see the first 3 or 4 headlines related to any kind of issue around AI, especially in an employment setting, but there's really 29 major issues that we have to deal with, right? You even referenced, for instance, cognitive decline, the death of some skills, the growth of other parts of our neurocognition, and how that changes, and things that we have to think about as humans, not just employers, but also as individual workers and future generations. But she always tells the fantastic story about how she was trying to ask some younger students what it was like to experience a payphone for the first time, and many of them said, "I don't even understand what a payphone is. I wouldn't know what to do with it if I walked up to it and did something with it." And it's the same thing that you might experience here when looking at some of the unintended consequences, as you laid out, when thinking about the onslaught of AI as we look at it today, right? That's a fair point. One of the things that I kind of want to jump ahead a little bit and start talking about impacts, both relatively recent and then those that are actually more longer term in your minds. One of the things that strikes me is in the first 8 weeks here, since we've had the issuance of President Trump's executive order, one of the things that strikes me is that we're seeing employers react, whether it's through immediate impact or through just general analysis, if you will. Rachel, what are you seeing from employers when it comes to that? What are you seeing employers actually do just in general reaction in the immediate term?
Well, I think there's all of these executive orders that have, gotten employers, really struggling to understand what's going on, and the pace of change, and the pace of, legal challenges and sorting all of that out has been, really intense. And we haven't gotten a lot of federal AI policy. That, we have the executive order, we have the vice president's speech, we have some early, indications from the government. Stay tuned. I think we'll see stuff coming out of the administration, soon, where I think employers are really trying to understand what's going on, with AI regulation, is understanding the interaction between whatever the federal government does or does not do, and states, and all of, whether it's California, Colorado, Texas, Virginia, all of these state legislatures and regulatory agencies trying to say, well, if the federal government's not going to do it, we're going to enforce state law. We're going to pass new state laws governing, specifically putting in requirements, putting the brakes on AI in HR, addressing some of these risks, trying to address some of these risks, as well as the international regulatory environment. So that complexity, I think whatever the deregulatory philosophy of the Trump administration may eventually be or communicated through policy and other things. I think state and international, really makes employers think and pause and try to understand how all of this applies.
Ben, how about you? What are you seeing as far as a big impact so far?
In my head, I picture the person running around with their hair on fire, trying to decide what to do next, sort of a little bit. As Rachel said, a lot of the different companies that I'm talking to are saying, well, if it's not coming here, that the state piece is a critical component. I'm glad you touched on that, Rachel, because that was one of the things I meant to mention earlier is even when the government was a little bit unsure about how they were going to make these things go for different areas or protect certain rights of the workforce, different states, New York City passed a law, things like that, to try to put their own stamp on that. If they were tired of waiting, they were going to take action on behalf of the people in those regions. Overall, as Rachel said a minute ago, it's a really great call out that it's still a bit of a waiting game. We're getting little drips and drabs, little snippets of what's possible, their vision of what the future looks like. But until they really put down exactly what they're expecting, we start hearing back from how things are going to start shifting. It's sort of a waiting game. And so if I was leading HR for an employer right now, and I was listening to this conversation today, I would be having conversations with my leadership about what sort of things may be coming down the line. I would be talking to my leadership about what sort of AI tools we should or should not be using. Are we having people use these right now? What does that mean for their jobs? Are we thinking about the future of that? I would just start having some exploratory discussions around that and not wait until something happens, because by the time it happens, it's really too late in some cases. So I would start encouraging them just to really start leaning into that. I was reading a piece just this morning from McKinsey, and it's quantifying what percentage of HR work, even if we're going to get really specific and focused on this profession, the data show that up to 75% of the work that an HR person does can be automated right now with AI tools. And so we need to be having these discussions, because if not, we're going to end up in a place where we don't want to be ultimately. And I want us to do this intentionally with real focus, with effort, with not happenstance, because we know that tends towards chaos.
So I'm going to pose one question, and it's completely unplanned, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. That's my calling card. I have an unplanned question every time. One of the things that I'll ask each of you is, in one word, how would you describe the posture that a CHRO should be taking towards AI in their organization, in one word? And Ben, I know you were just talking, but I'm going to throw it to you first.
First, one word: curious.
All right. Rachel?
Aware.
All right. I like it. I really appreciate that. Believe it or not, folks, I am sorry to say that our time here today is done. We've actually reached the end of our program, and that's going to do it today for this week's episode. A big thank you to Rachel and Ben for sharing their expertise and deep insights with us. Before we say goodbye, I encourage you to follow the AI+HI Project wherever you enjoy your podcasts. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to comment, leave a review, etc., anything that indicates how much you enjoyed the episode. Finally, you can find all our episodes on our website at shrm.org/AIHI. Thanks for joining the conversation, and we'll see you next time.
SHRM.